Peter asked me if I'd do some research into Qianlong, not the jade sort like Michael Lau's piece here, not the tinkling jades, but the reticulated porcelain which was named after it. At the time, he also asked me if I would take a look at Maitong, but I really didn't have time for that, so I didn't do anything on the so-called rice pattern porcelain. And the paper I wrote basically only covered late Ming Qianlong, both the domestic market and the export ware. So tonight I'd like to make amends for that shortcoming and extend the time frame out to the earliest days, the Neolithic period, all the way through to the end of the Qing, and then at the end I will say a few words about the missing bit, which is the rice pattern porcelain. There's lots of slides, far too many, but I want to use them not just to look at the technique of piercing porcelain, but also to explore the way in which there was interaction between the private kilns and the official kilns over the long run. This is something that I noticed when I did the original paper, and I'm fascinated about the way the sort of pendulum swings between the two different sets of kilns. So, the earliest pieces I've managed to find with holes in it are the Liangzhu and the Longshan culture. This is a Longshan vase, it's in the Met, and it's got slots. Now, apart from the fact that they've got some perforation, apart from the fact that they are remarkably thin and polished, have that sort of polished look, they have one other thing in common. That is that they suddenly disappear. Round about 2400, it stops. And there's a 2 millennium gap between these and any other pierced porcelain. What happened? Well, there are various theories about why the Longshan culture stopped. Not all of them very satisfying, but I suspect because there are similar gaps in history elsewhere in the world, I suspect it was a cataclysmic event, a catastrophe, and my pet candidate is a meteor strike on the Bini Lake in Iraq. That meteor wiped out the whole of the Akkadian civilization. All of the records in the Akkadians just stopped at that particular date. And it must have caused immense environmental and climatic damage as well. But that's purely speculative.
Sorry, when was this?
This is 2400 BC. So we now do a hop, step and a jump to the Eastern Way. This is one of my favourite pieces. It's in the Nelson Atkins Museum. When I see bits like this, the first question I have is, well, how on earth did they make it? Now, take a close look. Turn it upside down. If you turn it upside down, it's a bit like a small vase. It's been potted normally. It's been allowed to dry, and then somebody's taken a careful knife to it and put those slots in the sides. But even then, how did they do this funny ring around? I still can't work that bit out. No matter, I think it's a rather elegant piece. This is completely different. At first you think it's a piece of open work. It's not. The little legs here must have been moulded, and then the whole piece was assembled, luted together. These two, the reason I put them there is a technical reason. They're not particularly elegant. They're from the northern Xi, so 550, 577 in the Christian era. The reason I put them there is because of these lugs. Now, most of these early pieces, they're very functional. These jars would have been suspended from a tripod. If you look carefully, these lugs, they've not been stuck on the jar. They've been pulled from the body of the piece as it's been thrown. And just to emphasize that point, these decorative bits, those are applied rather than pulled. But these bits to give it strength, they were pulled from the vessel before it was fired. Moving on, an incense burner in the Suzhou Museum. I think it's pretty clear that that's based on a bronze model. Bear in mind that from the time that the Longshan culture was wiped out, the artisans spent more time doing earthenware of various sort and bronzeware. So there were plenty of bronze models to base new ceramics on. And I think this is a classic. It's not an incense burner. It's a brazier. It's a hand warmer. This again would have been suspended, full of charcoal or whatever, and used just as a metal one would have been. Again, functional. This one, which was sold at auction about a year ago in Hong Kong, I put this one in because it illustrates the difference between bronze, and this was modelled on a bronze candlestick, and ceramics. Now, the obvious difference is you can't melt porcelain paste and pour it into a mould. But it's more complicated than that. Even if you could melt porcelain paste and pour it into a mould, it would tear apart inside the mould, because earthenware shrinks about 6 to 8% when it's fired. Porcelain shrinks about 14 to 15%. So if you do a complex three-dimensional object like that, it'll actually tear apart. You can't do it. You can use moulding for basically quite simple and symmetrical things. So this one's been assembled after the pieces have been made separately. Moving on to the tang, you begin to get a bit more sense of decoration in these pieces. And if Madam would prefer to have a green one, we make those too. This is interesting because, yes, it's been thrown, it's been allowed to dry, the slots have been cut in the side, but look at the roundels. Those are very different. Those must have been made by some sort of die cutter, because they're all exactly the same. Then they would have been finished by hand. But you get a sense going through this series that the potters are beginning to learn their craft. They're beginning to master the material, and that becomes more obvious in what I call the turning point of the Northern Song. Previously, the pieces I've shown you are all essentially very functional, with a bit of decoration here and there. Here you've got a marriage of form and function. The potters have mastered their art. They can do whatever they want. This one, I have to apologize to the curators in museums around the world. When they find something that they don't recognize, they describe it as either a pomander or an incense burner. It has to be one or the other. So this one is a slotted pomander. I think that's nonsense, and I think Edwin, if he was here, would say, no, this is a drinking vessel holder. Likewise, this one, this is another pomander. No, this would have been a lamp. But I put this one here because I'd like you to look at those little upside-down heart-shaped decorations, because we're going to meet those again soon. Again, this is the same period, Tang, again, Nelson Atkins Museum, which is a great museum. Again, perfect marriage of form and function. This would have been technically very difficult to make. It's probably been made in 3 pieces. The top bit was moulded separately from the bits which were pierced. And this is Yaozhouware. Notice that all the pieces you've seen so far are basically northern kilns. And from this period, Northern Song, the form and function come together almost perfectly. This Yuware, which is in the Sangzhou Museum, has a sister in the Art Institute, which was bought by T.T. Choi. You can see that the potters can do what they like with the material. They've mastered it completely. Okay, now we're going to go south. In the year 1003, the residents of a small town of Qianlong woke up and found that their gracious emperor had bestowed his reign name on their town. From 1003 onwards, Qianlong was called Jingdezhen. The reign name was Jingde. And they also found that he'd set up an office for supervision and tax, which reminds me of President Ronald Reagan's famous the 9 most terrifying words in the English language. I'm from the government and I'm here to help you. So why did the emperor bestow his name on Jingdezhen? I suspect there was an element of both push and pull. During the Song, the quality of the Qingbai ware in Qianlong had gone nationwide. So they knew that here was a town which was capable of producing very high quality ceramics, like this one in the KS Low collection, which is a beauty. But there was also a push factor. The northern tribes, the Khitan, were nibbling away at the northern border. In fact, in 954, they got down as far as Kaifeng. And the northern kilns were caught in between the Khitan, who became the Liao, and the Song. Some of the potters in the northern kilns were actually kidnapped and taken north, and some of them fled south. And if you want to see a fingerprint, recognize? To me, that's as good as a fingerprint. A northern potter would come down. If you look at the early Qingbai ware, there's almost no piercing or cutting. But after 1003, the latter half of the Northern Song, there's a bit more. There's more piercing, there's more of this kind of work. To me, that suggests that there's a migration of potters down to the south. Now, in the early part of the Yun, 1278, the Bureau for Supervision and Taxation was replaced by the Fuliang Porcelain Bureau, which was an indication that the Yun were taking Jingdezhen more seriously as a place for producing imperial porcelains. But bear in mind that at this point there was no such thing as an official kiln. All of the kilns in Jingdezhen were private. It was a very private sector city. There was a clear separation between the potting, the manufacture of the pieces, and the kilns. The kilns were highly specialized, and the potters would club together and put their pieces inside a kiln. They'd contract for a mass firing. There were big and there were small, but generally speaking, there was a clear separation between the production of potted pieces and the firing of pieces. So the man who was appointed to the Fuliang Bureau of Porcelain, the official, he had to basically farm out his orders for imperial ware to the potters, and then he had to contract with one of the kilns, obviously choosing the better kilns, to have them fired. It would be 100 years before, this is the end of the first Ming Emperor's reign. It was 100 years before the first official kilns, the imperial depot, was established. But during the Yun, they got quite bold. Now, I put this slide in not because it's beautiful, I think it's pretty ugly, but if you look at the base, it's warped. Again, a technical point. If you cut stuff out of a piece of porcelain that's been thrown, even if you've dried it quite well, the danger is that it's been so weakened that it will either collapse or warp when it's fired. And the failure rates of things like this stand were very high. But they kept trying. The Yun were quite adventurous, as in the Jiaqing period, very adventurous. This is a double-walled cup with a little bit of fancy inserts on the outside. This one's in the Percival David. There's another one just like it in the Gulbenkian in Lisbon. They got quite adventurous with applied pieces. How did they do these things? How did they not collapse in the kiln? I think in practice they would put some vegetable material, some twine or whatever, underneath the applied piece, and that would burn away in the kiln, but it would stop it collapsing and sort of melding into the main piece. This is obviously one that was made for the Middle Eastern market. These are quite extraordinary. Now, this one's in the Palace Museum in Beijing. There's another one in the Percival David, which doesn't have its lid. and there's a couple in private collections. But look at them. They're not double-walled jars, but the potter has created 4 cavities, one behind, one on the left and right. And then having created the cavity, he's produced a piece of open work quite separately, the lozenge with the floral decoration, and fitted it into the space so that there is a gap between that decoration and the body of the jar behind. The failure rate must have been horrendous. But these were obviously a hit. This one was found in Baoding, not far south of Beijing. Although during the Yun, a lot of imperial ware was commissioned in Jingdezhen, it didn't mean that they stopped using other kilns. The Yun controlled a much larger empire than the Song. And the northern kilns in Shanxi, the Liuli kilns, were producing from about 400. They were producing some very complicated architectural pieces, open work, finials for rooftops, and so on. And the most famous of those is the great Nine-Dragon Wall in Datong, which the first Ming emperor commissioned for his 13th son. And they did some remarkable stuff. This is my favorite. It's in San Francisco. And again, how did they do it? This is a double-walled vase. Now I suspect that the inner part of the jar and the base were thrown first and allowed to dry. And the open work decoration was probably thrown separately and then allowed to dry and then carved. And then the inner part would be wrapped with twine, whatever, to give it a bit of insulation before the sleeve was dropped over the top and the lid put on, and then it was fired. Horribly complicated, but what a fantastic result. Triple phoenix vase. It's quite big, it's about so big. So again, risk of collapse in the kiln, huge. This was also made in the same Shanxi kilns, the Liuli kilns, and we have a date for this one because it has an inscription in it, 1512. 100 years later, a basically similar incense burner was made in Jingdezhen, and again it has a date. So again, you see this migration of, if not the potters, certainly the techniques, the styles, from north to south. And the northern kilns have been experimenting with fahua for a long time. Some of that came to the south. This is, to my mind, the most extreme version of form taking precedence over function. Oh, by the way, Anthony, we'll come back to one of yours in a moment, but that turquoise glaze is judging. That's how it's displayed in the British Museum, but that's how it should look. The stand on the right belongs to it. And if you look at it from this perspective, you'll notice that it's not a double-walled piece. It's actually just full of holes. So what on earth was it used for? It's got such a narrow neck, you couldn't use it for a pomander, you couldn't use it for a lamp, you couldn't really use it for it. I don't know what it's used for. But it's a phenomenal piece of workmanship. They say the fahua was, as a tradition, started in the north but migrated south. This one was a Jingdezhen piece from the early Ming dynasty. Phenomenal double-walled jar. The same techniques were used to make the drum stool on the right, and the perforations allowed the seats to be cooler than they would have been if they were solid, as well as lighter. The one on your left, the celadon, is earlier. That's a Yun piece. And again, the potter has been extremely daring. He's taken out an awful lot of clay before firing it. Why it didn't collapse, I have no idea, but it's a pretty good piece. But the masterpiece, I mean, the Longquan kilns in Qianlong perfected the celadons. But this pair, which C.P. Lin exhibited in the Radiant Ming exhibition, I think they take the biscuit. They are absolutely gorgeous. again, very difficult to make, a combination of reserved decoration with all of the reticulation as well. This and its sister are the two masterpieces, to my mind, for the celadons made in Jingdezhen. So, now a word or two about what I call the transfer of technology. You all know that the first Ming emperor was a bit of a control freak. He insisted that people stay basically where they were born. He introduced a corvée system which obliged everybody to provide some of their labour to the empire every year. And he also, at the end of his reign, set up the Imperial Porcelain depot in Jingdezhen. And that combination of a depot and the corvée system produced what I call the potter aristocracy, which began in the beginning of the reign. Hongwu, the first emperor, was desperate for more and more porcelain. And that created a sort of an industrialized process in Jingdezhen. He wasn't after beauty, he was after quantity. He needed to trade it for horses. And so he pressed the kilns to produce more and more really quite standardized stuff for export. But the stuff which was produced at the same time for imperial use was probably a higher quality. And the workforce for the depot and the kilns, again, there were no official kilns when he started, but by the end of his reign, the best of the kilns had been designated green kilns, and these were the kilns which were basically working only for the emperor. And that combination produced a workforce which was drawn from only 1,000 families, 4 shifts during the year, four lots of corvée work during any 1 year. And a third of those families came only from the Raozhou area. So a very small, tight-knit group of families whose whole lives were spent basically producing high-quality work for the emperor. His successor but one, Yongle, the production numbers went up even higher because Winglok needed not just bulk, he needed beauty. He needed porcelain which he could present to foreign dignitaries because he was providing diplomatic gifts for the great admiral on his voyages around the Indian Ocean. So the quality began to go up quite rapidly. And I've seen some pieces in Lhasa, in Tibet, in a museum there, which were imperial gifts, and they are as good as anything which you'd ever find in the palace. The glazes are just stupendous. The high point of production, 443,500 pieces made in 1 year, was 1444. That was during the Swan Sindak period. And it was also it was the year of the final voyage by Zheng He. And after that, as we all know, China shut its doors, burnt the boats, burnt the logbooks, and stopped sending people around the world to distribute largesse. At least that's the official version. In practice, just as the restoration of the Grand Canal provided a boost to the domestic economy, so the Admiral's voyages around the Indian Ocean had a sort of trade development council effect. The foreigners began descending on China looking for high quality goods. And we know that even just the silver from the Korean and Japan trade produced a multiplier effect with the gentry, the scholar gentry in China spending more and more on luxury goods. During this period, in effect, the official kilns became the technological and aesthetic leaders of Jingdezhen. But when after the admiral stopped running around the Indian Ocean, when the imperial demand for porcelain began to decline, there was still ample demand in the domestic market because of the money which was coming through from illegal trade. And although it was for a 50-year period, although imperial production in Jingdezhen was down, private production was up. It wasn't until Anthony's favourite period, Jiajing, that the numbers began to climb up again. And we don't know the exact number because in 1528 there was a fire which destroyed all of the records. But we do know from the diaries that Jingdezhen had become an extraordinary industrial town. We also know that during the Jiajing period, because there was not sufficient capacity in the official kilns, the official bureau, started a policy of contracting out. So the goods would be made the production of the pieces would have been done by the official kiln, the official depot, but they'd be fired in the civilian kilns. And because there wasn't sufficient capacity, by the end of the Jiajing period, there were some 50 green kilns. So 50, several tens more kilns have been licensed to do official work. And there were another 20 very large private kilns which were routinely being asked to do the overflow in production. Pretty extraordinary. One of the unintended consequences of this policy was that they lost the intellectual property. The technical skills began to migrate from the official kilns and the official manufactories to the private kilns. And gradually the process of corvée labour was modified, and it was possible for private manufacturers to buy out the corvée labour and hire some of the skilled labour from the official kilns, which, as we will see, has interesting consequences. But business was good. Again, we have the diaries to thank for this. Oh, sorry, where have we gone? We'll come back later. This is one of Anthony's pieces. There's a period in the Jiajing which I think of as being very, very creative. This is, my excuse for putting it here is because it's got 3 or 4 holes in it, but it is a brand new form. These were not produced before the Jiajing period, nor were these. I'm not sure about the colour, Anthony. This is another one of Anthony's. This is a brush stand. Bear in mind, brush pots had not yet been invented. So that little turquoise one I showed you earlier, same period. And these beginning to look like jade, the insert which has been put into the side of the vase, just an imitation of its silver counterpart. But they also experimented with new glazes. This is the finest example I've so far found. It's in Australia, National Gallery, Victoria. And it's part of a type of glaze which was picked up and worked on and eventually became quite important with export ware. They also perfected gilding on biscuit. This had been experimented with during the Yuan dynasty, but the gold leaf kept falling off. But at some point in the Jiajing, an artisan discovered that if he rubbed raw garlic on the biscuit, the gilding would stick. And that is in the records officially. But of course, if you're contracting out, sometimes you can't trust the contractor, so in this case it fell off. Didn't use enough garlic. But that would originally, we think of it as blue and white, originally it would have had gold where the biscuit is. And gold figures quite prominently in the Jiajing period. This, what we now call Qinranda, became a hit for export wear. It's more common to see it in bowls, but this piece in the bow is, I think, absolutely gorgeous. And trade was good, business was good. North, south, east and west, and the businessmen are making enormous profits. Note, not the official kilns are making enormous profits. It's the private kilns that are making the money. And technically, there's been huge progress. There was nothing that could not be made. Think about that. This is after Jiajing, this is Longqing Manding. Nothing that cannot be made. But if that's true, then why is the supervising secretary of the Imperial Depot complaining? He actually wrote this very strongly worded memorandum to the emperor saying, please stop ordering candlesticks, screens, brush handles, etc., which are needlessly extravagant. And he described them as ling lung. In fact, he used other much stronger language. First it was watch out, over the top. Then his successor, Yintao, decadent or effete. Now, you're addressing the emperor, so you must be pretty upset about something to say this. But if anything could be made, what's he complaining about? Well, let's look at the sort of stuff he complained about. This is Titi Cho's. It's now in Shatin. Now, that would be pretty risky to fire. I can see that would have trouble in the kiln. Likewise, this again, lots more turquoise. Brush. I wouldn't have thought brush handles were difficult, but I suppose the hollow bit might sag. Anthony, another one of yours. Lots of little holes in the top. But I think the riskier part here would have been the dividers because of the shrinkage. They could very easily tear or bend in the process. Likewise, these. A lot of hollowing out there. These would have been horrible. 250 of these were ordered in 1484. They probably had to do twice as many as that, if not more, in order to get that number, because the cutting away would weaken the structure. That's the ventilated seat. And then there are these. 400 of this type of pen stand, brush stand, were ordered in any year. Or these absolutely hideous polychrome versions of the same. And if you're Wang Jinming, the supervisor of the kilns, and your guys were producing this sort of rubbish, how would you feel when the private sector was producing gorgeous things like this next door? You'd be a little bit embarrassed. I love this piece, it's in Nikime. But they were doing, in the private kilns, we know from the diarists that they were experimenting with cutting away, with doing eggshell porcelain and the like. Cutting away of this sort, now this is getting closer to carved jades. Look at the fineness in there. I mean, that's extraordinary. That's a cash pattern. This one, which has got a roundels as well with the batsin, the 8 fairies on it. That's not what it actually looked like when it was made, because it was enamelled. This is the only one I found which has got its complete clothing. It's in the Waters Museum in Baltimore. But there's another one in the bow which is quite good. Oh, by the way, that little handbag thing here, that was movable.
Wow.
So again, how did you do that? There, this is another one which is more hole than bowl. It's one of my favourites that you all know, the brush washers. I was a bit annoyed with the museum when they catalogued these, because although we'd told them what they were, they insisted that they were drinking vessels, which is nonsense. This, think about, you're in the countryside, you're painting, basically you're relying on water from the river or a rain butt, so you dip it in the rain butt. This is the sieve to keep the rubbish out. And then you pour the water through this. You wouldn't originally have had that. You pour the water through that hole and it's pure water. But they often had poems, drinking poems on them. Another one. These are quite clearly, they're not export ware. People sometimes think of Qianlong as being export ware. In fact, it was originally a domestic market product aimed at the scholar gentry. Why else would you put a complex poem by Sodong Bo on it? Or something like this, which would be useless to any Guilo in Holland. Or this is the classic 56 character poem encouraging young aspiring scholars to study hard. No wonder the kilns called it Guai Gong. And I think this helps to explain why Wang Jingming was so upset. He faced 4 challenges. The biggest challenge of all was that the traditional clay pits close to Jingdezhen had been worked out, and the alternative source of supply was twice as far away and therefore cost twice as much to transport. He's basically working in a government department and he's got a fixed budget. He can't afford the good clay. So what happens? He gets a much higher failure rate in the kiln. Worse than that, because the corvée system had been basically abolished with the Yatiaobin, the single whip plaques in 1560, there'd been a migration of the technically best and artistically best workers from the imperial, the official kilns and workshops, to the private kilns. And why were they going? Because they paid better, because business was good. There was a huge increase in demand, not just for export ware, but also domestically. So poor old Wang Jingming was really having a problem. That's why he could only produce the less good work, the less good brush stands and so on. Which brings us to the foreigners. You all know that the Portuguese arrived at the beginning of the 16th century, and they concentrated on regional trade rather than international trade. The Dutch, when they arrived, they got into international trade big time. In 1522, they attacked Macau because they weren't welcomed in Guangzhou. The Portuguese made very sure that they weren't welcome in Guangzhou. So they attacked Macau, but they failed to take it. But with the assistance of Jingdezhen, the amazing pirate, admiral, politician, whatever, they were encouraged to set up at Fort Zeelandia in Taiwan. So their Fujianese partners, Jingdezhen was a Fujianese who traded with Japan, married a Japanese lady. The Fujianese partners would bring stuff down to Yukong, the moon harbour near Zhuangzhou, ship it across to the Dutch in Fort Zeelandia, where it would be sorted and checked for quality before it was repackaged and sent down to Batavia in Indonesia. At first, the Dutch took whatever they gave them, including things like this. Notice again, movable ball at the top. But that's what it really looked like. It's a detail from a still life by William Culp. It's basically the same piece, but with its clothes on. And then they begin to change. They begin to pick up, they become more familiar with what's being produced in Jingdezhen. They'd heard about eggshell porcelain and cutaway porcelain. And so they start asking for it. And so their Fujianese partners begin to start supplying it. And we know they started supplying it because this is from a manifest at a Dutch ship. And we know what it looks like because some of it was found in the Hatcher wreck. This may not be as fine as the domestic eggshell porcelain, but it's still translucent. This may not be as fine as some of those scholars' pieces which you saw, but it's still got holes in it, and it was a big hit back in Holland. There's a rather larger version. Most of them are small, that's a better version. And the cutaway stuff, this is one from the British Museum. I think these were probably just as difficult, if not more difficult to make than the purely pierced ones. And there aren't many good examples of it, but this teapot I think is one of the best. And the Dutch were commercially very, very clever. they took what they knew was being produced and they simplified it to reduce cost. Look at those three. The one at the top is one made for the domestic market. These two are made for export. Ultra-fine cash pattern, much simpler swastika pattern, very rudimentary fish scales and slots. These, rather like the two incense burners we saw earlier from the Tang period, these were probably just cut with a die. They weren't cut by hand. They also adapted and simplified for Western taste. These are basically the same design, but look what's happened. The Chinese design of swastika pattern has been changed into a much simpler floral pattern for the guailou, and it was cheaper to make. You could sell it for the same price. But they then began, next step, they began sending wooden models of things they wanted to Jingdezhen so they could be made, and these were functional, funnels for a European market. Trivets, sugar casters, tea trays. But all good things come to an end. In 1644, the year that the last Ming emperor committed suicide, the Dutch in Fort Zeelandia heard news that there was bloodshed in Jingdezhen. And they were so worried by it, and their Fujianese partner, Jingdezhen, was so worried by it that he advised that they go north to Kyushu. And since he was friendly with the shogun, it wasn't long after that before they set up in the Hirado kilns in Kyushu, which I think all of you will know. What most people don't know is that they took some of the potters from Jingdezhen with them. And the potters were willing to leave the bloodshed and migrate to Kyushu. And some of them had skills with making linglong. And those skills were handed down. The cutaway pattern, Edo period. Even today, the Hirado kiln in Kyushu is the only Japanese kiln which really specializes in cutaway work and three-dimensional porcelain. Relearning old skills. The transitional period, we know that by 1652 the Manchus were in control of Jingdezhen, but there's a bit of a debate as to when the official kilns began producing again. You're all familiar with the story about the big dragon bowls which they had trouble firing. One of those was reconstructed at Chinese U in an exhibition a few years back. But they had 5 attempts between 1654 and 59 throughout the period to make them, and failed completely. Private sector kilns also had difficulty. You've lost a generation of potters, basically. People have been killed, people have run away. It takes a while to get things sorted out again. But the private kilns got their act together more quickly. This would be one of the early pieces made for the Middle Eastern market. Double skin vessel, a bit crude, but not long after they were doing much more elegant pieces, again for export. And then gradually the domestic market, experimenting with new designs like this cricket cage. Interestingly, this slotted pattern turns up on a dish in the Palace Museum, which the catalogue says is Qianlong. I don't think it has a mark, and my guess is it's actually a Kangxi piece rather than Qianlong. Again, they began experimenting with a more sculptural approach to perforations in this polychrome version of the cricket cage. They got quite daring in doing much larger format pieces like these perforated lamps. Think about it, each one of these panels, both the small and the large panels, would have to be made separately and then luted together before they were fired. So again, the failure rate must have been horrid. But they proved a success, and they were still producing them all the way through to the middle of the 19th century. I do like the Tongzhou rain colours. Again, the sculpture is going back to Kangxi. The sculptural work is evident again in brush pots like these, and in the imitation rock, the rocaille base for these parrots. Turquoise took off in a big way in Europe. Now, I've no idea why blue parrots should be so popular in Europe, but these were a big success. And no doubt partly because Marie Antoinette was really into turquoise pieces. Over in Dehua, they started doing stencil work, and I think this was the inspiration for the work in Jingdezhen, which was done in the private kilns on soft paste, like these miniature brush pots, and this slightly more elegant lady with the chin. And then they morphed into decorative pieces, again, still soft paste. This is a genuine pomander. And then the well-known dragon and phoenix snuff bottles. And these would have been made exactly the same way as that big jar which I showed you much earlier. Make the inside bit first, 2 molds to make the 2 halves of the shell, the perforated shell, wrap it in string, fire it. And the stuff that you know I like, we'll go through that quickly. But look at that, this almost floats in the middle of the lid. Meantime, under the guidance of the legendary Tong Ying, the official kilns got their act together. This is a brilliant brush stand, brilliantly glazed, brilliantly perforated. It's in San Francisco. A lovely celadon. Interestingly, this is an imitation of similar vases which were produced during the Ming, one of which was on offer about a month ago in Hong Kong. And then more complicated double-walled vessels like this. This extraordinary optical illusion of a floating top. This rather ugly challenge to the ivory carvers of Guangzhou. If you want to see a rather more elegant pair of perforated pieces, go down to Christie's. There is one spectacular vase.
Yes.
And the bits I like in particular are these hat stands. This one, Hall of Mental Cultivation in Beijing. This one, Palace Museum as well. But one of my favourites is the one on the right, which is just a cutaway. And that's in the Gulbenkian. Again, there is a hat stand with a totally different design, but well perforated at Christie's. Go there, I recommend it. 1710-11, the Europeans finally worked out how to make porcelain at Meissen, and they began to try and compete with the European kilns, so with the Chinese kilns. But how do you compete with something like this? I may not like the colour scheme, but it's a pretty splendid piece. That's 19th century. The only European kiln which got close to doing Linglong pottery was Herend, the Hungarian kiln. And it's this piece. Almost everything they tried to do to imitate the most finely perforated porcelain out of Jingdezhen collapsed in the kiln into a soggy mess. This is extraordinarily heavily potted, but they did manage to at least preserve it. Finally, my last section, which is going to be on the rice pattern stuff. It's very badly represented in museums around the world. This one in the British Museum is from a private kiln. It's dated 1798 and signed by the potter. It has a fairly simple pattern. This one is in Australia, and they're convinced that it has a good Guangzhou rain mark. As far as I can see, it's unique, and I'm a bit suspicious of the Guangzhou mark. But the pattern is slightly better than the private sector one in the British Museum. And most of the apocryphal marks on pieces in the British Museum are Honghei, Kangxi period. But when I started looking at this stuff, I was convinced that the the origins of rice pattern porcelain would have been an accident in the kilns in Jingdezhen, where the glaze ran and filled in some of the holes in the Qianlong. But a visit to Tehran, the Museum of Glassware and Porcelain, convinced me otherwise. The Persians have been producing this stuff since the 11th and 12th century, and the holes are filled in with a transparent glaze. They even did some even more complicated double-walled ewers. And then, if we go back to the transitional period, remember the Dutch had to go from Taiwan to Kyushu to keep their trade going. During that period, the supply chain to Europe was severely interrupted, and the biggest beneficiary of that disruption were the kilns in Iran. The Iranian potters have been trying to emulate Chinese potters for centuries, and they had this wonderful opportunity, and they began producing what is called fritware. And it had huge popularity in Europe and in North America in the 17th century. Some of it is really quite remarkable. It looks like glass, but it's not. It's a porcelain with a very glassy glaze. And some of it can be quite elegant. And some of it found its way to China. And in my lurid imagination, I have this image of the Iranian ambassador presenting something like this to the emperor and trying to hide a smile when the emperor sort of holds it up to the light and says, wow. And as soon as the ambassador's out of the room, you can hear the emperor dictating a memorandum to Tong Ying, saying, why aren't you producing stuff like this? Get on with it. And they did get on with it. And they started producing stuff like this. This is Jingdezhen. And there's not been really very much research done on this stuff. Here's a lidded bowl, Brooklyn Museum. Oh, I've gone the wrong way, sorry. A rather more elegant piece. The biggest piece I found is in, again, San Francisco. They all have basically the same floral pattern. So they're all being done by the same workshop. And there was a workshop in Jingdezhen by this time, under Tong Ying's leadership, which was devoted purely to carving and incising and piercing. Technically, it's not much more difficult than doing Qianlong, but it's very time consuming. So first of all, you have to throw the piece, you have to let it dry, and then you pierce it, and then every single hole has to be dabbed with a brush with some transparent glaze on it. Then it has to be allowed to dry, and then you do it again. And it takes at least 30 coatings before it's ready for firing. And you can only do 5 coatings a day. So there's a week's worth of work in doing a simple bowl before it can even be fired. And then it's got to be polished. So not easy stuff to do. As I said, there's not much research done on it, but one person who did it was Eleanor Hartstone, an American. She and her husband collected this stuff. They did an exhibition of basically export ware. But as part of her research, she wrote to some 50 museums and institutions around the world to see if they had any and what they knew about it. Only about half of them replied, and most of them said, well, we think it's Yongjing Qianlong, but we're not sure. And I think they were relying on a passage in the great Hobson's textbook. And Hobson had also made the same connection with the Persian kilns. Some of the stuff they had on display was truly hideous, like this. So the question I had was, well, how do we know it's Yongjing Qianlong? I was lucky. I struck lucky in a catalogue. I found a bowl with a hallmark, and there was a Chai Hua Tang in the Forbidden City in the Yongjing Qianlong period. And then I noticed that it belonged to Richard Kahn. So I asked Richard, what do you know about it? He said, do you have any more? Tony, dear boy, of course I have. I've got 2. 2 Qianlong. Here you are. So we're pretty safe. We know it's Qianlong, even if it wasn't made in the Yongjing period. There was one other piece, though, which had a hallmark, which Eleanor Hartstone found. It was in the Flint Institute of Art in America. And she was told that it was Yongjing. But the mark is not Yongjing, it's a hallmark. Jingwei Tang. And again, Jingwei Tang, there was a hall with this name in the Forbidden City in the Yongjing Qianlong period. But the curators at Flint are lovely people, and they took some special photos. You notice it's got a dragon design, not the floral design. And then they did some even fancier work. It may not be a nice colour, but definitely 5 claws. So I think it's safe to say that this was a dish made for imperial use in the Jingwei Tang. Definite imperial connection. And on that note, final piece, pièce de résistance for the pierced porcelain. Again, Qianlong. It might have been devil's work, but it had a divine outcome. Thank you for listening.
The chain is porcelain? Wow, amazing.
How did they do that?
I think we should give Tony a big hand.
Thank you. I'm afraid we're well over time for food.
No, fantastic. This is amazing.